In April of 1973, with the early oats already 4 inches up across the bottom fields and the dogwoods just turning along the fence rows, Lyle Halverson walked into Darnell's Feed and Supply on the square in Belknap, Tilden County, Missouri, with a folded sheet of butcher paper in the chest pocket of his canvas work jacket and a quiet question for the man behind the counter, and he was halfway across the worn pine boards when the laughter started up at the back. "A dam," Norman Wentland said, leaning against the seed corn display with his clipboard pressed flat to his chest, his mouth already wide open with the next laugh waiting in it. "Lyle Halverson is going to build himself a dam." There were 4 men gathered around Wentland, 2 of them co-op delivery drivers, one of them the assistant manager from the John Deere lot over in Falworth, the 4th, a thin, red-faced cattle hauler named Otis Mossman. And they laughed, when Wentland laughed, the way men in feed stores have always laughed at whatever the loudest man in the room tells them is funny. Lyle Halverson stood 3 steps inside the door and said nothing. He held the butcher paper drawing folded once in his right hand, the pencil lines on the inside of the fold, the spillway diagram he had spent 11 evenings working out at the kitchen table laid plainly enough that any honest man could read it. His left hand was in the pocket of his canvas jacket, resting on the 37-year-old USDA conservation pamphlet his father had carried home from a county extension meeting in the spring of 1937. He was 68 years old. He had farmed those 240 acres for 41 years. His south fields had gone yellow in August of 1956 and again in July of 1963, and he had watched a neighbor lose 40 head of cattle to thirst in the second of those summers, and he had been thinking about the back 40 Creek for 19 years before he ever picked up a pencil. "Norman," Lyle said, and that was the only word he spoke, and he laid the butcher paper open on the counter, and Norman Wentland walked over from the seed corn display, still half smiling, and bent over it. Wentland was 41. He had a degree in civil engineering from a state college in Rolla, and 4 years on the Tilden County Public Works payroll, and an orange pen behind his right ear that he used to make small dismissive marks on other people's drawings. He looked at Lyle's diagram for perhaps 11 seconds. Then he straightened up, tapped the paper twice with the orange pen, and said the line that the men in Darnell's would still be repeating to each other at coffee in the spring of 1974 and the spring of 1975 and the spring of every year after, until they stopped repeating it because they could not stand the sound of it any longer. "That's not a dam, Lyle. That's a mud pile waiting for the first hard rain to wash it down to the Mississippi." The laughter started again. Lyle folded the butcher paper back along its single crease, slid it into his chest pocket, paid $1.40 for 2 pounds of fence staples and a tin of axle grease he did not actually need, and walked out of Darnell's onto the brick square in Belknap, with the late April sun warm on the back of his neck. He drove the 11 miles home in a 1965 Chevrolet pickup the color of a robin's egg, the bed empty except for the staples and the grease and a coil of half-inch manila rope he had been carrying back there since March. He did not say anything about the feed store to his wife Eunice when he came in for supper. He ate 2 helpings of pork and beans and a slice of yellow cake. After supper, he walked out to the back 40 in the long blue evening and stood at the lip of the small ravine where Sutter's Branch ran east to west across his property, and he watched the water for an hour, and he made a small mark on the inside cover of the 1937 USDA pamphlet with a stub of carpenter's pencil. The mark was a number. The number was 240. It meant 240 feet, the length of the earthen wall he had decided that evening he was going to build alone. Sutter's Branch was a tributary of the Big Pine River. It drained roughly 1,100 acres of upland pasture and oak ridge above Lyle's property, and ran year-round in normal years, and went to a thin trickle in dry ones. The ravine, where it crossed the back 40, was 41 feet deep at its lowest point and roughly 240 feet across at the lip, and the soil was a heavy yellow-brown clay over a band of weathered limestone, and Lyle Halverson had known that clay since he was 9 years old, when his father had first sent him down with a post-hole digger to set the corner of a goat pen against the south wall of the same ravine in the summer of 1914. The 1937 USDA pamphlet was titled Earthen Farm Pond Construction for the Small Operator, and it had been written by a soil conservation engineer named E.P. Threadgill out of the regional office in Lincoln, Nebraska. It was 48 pages long. It contained 6 fold-out diagrams, a table of recommended slope angles, a section on hand-cut spillway dimensions, and a single underlined sentence on page 19 that Lyle's father had circled in pencil sometime in 1939. The small farm pond, properly built, will outlive its builder by 100 years. Lyle had read that pamphlet in full 31 times by the spring of 1973. He could quote the slope angle table from memory. He started work on the morning of May 14, 1973. The temperature was 63 degrees. The wind was out of the southwest at 6 miles an hour. He drove the Chevrolet down to the back 40 with a long-handled round-point shovel in the bed, a square-mouthed coal shovel, a 4-tine manure fork, a steel tamping bar, 2 galvanized buckets, a 60-foot length of half-inch manila rope, and a wooden surveyor's tripod he had built from poplar in his grandfather's barn in 1947. He set the tripod on the south lip of the ravine, sighted across to the north lip with a pocket level, drove a stub of red-painted oak into the ground at each end, and stretched the rope between them. The rope was the dam line. It was 238 feet long. He left it there. The county engineer came out on the afternoon of May 16th. He came in a green Ford pickup with the white Tilden County Public Works seal on the door, and he stood at the south lip of the ravine with his clipboard pressed to his hip, and he looked at the rope and the 2 oak stobs, and he laughed a small, dry laugh through his nose. "You'll never get a permit for that, Lyle. Not from me." Lyle was 40 feet down inside the ravine by then, in the bottom of the cut, working a post-hole digger into the clay to take a soil sample. He climbed back up the south slope without hurrying, the soil sample in a coffee can in his left hand, and he set the can on the lip of the ravine 3 feet from Wentland's boots, and he wiped his palm on the leg of his Wranglers, and he looked Norman Wentland in the face for the second time in 26 days. "It's on my property, Norman. I'm not impounding water that crosses any line. I read the statute." Wentland blinked twice. He had not, in fact, read the statute. He had assumed Lyle would not have either. He stood for another 40 seconds at the lip of the ravine, made 3 small marks on his clipboard with the orange pen, and walked back to his green Ford without saying another word. He drove away. Lyle stood at the lip of the ravine and watched the dust settle on the gravel of Pickett Hollow Road for a long time before he climbed back down to his soil sample. He worked alone for the rest of that summer. He worked alone through all of the next. He had asked in the second week of May 1973 4 neighbors for help. He had asked Otis Mossman, who hauled cattle for a living and had a strong back and a flatbed truck. He had asked Cliff Tregenna, whose family had farmed the section north of the Halverson place for 3 generations. He had asked the brothers Harlan and Garrett Hutchinson, who ran 600 acres of corn and beans on the long rolling ground east of State Route 19. None of the 4 said yes. Otis Mossman said he had a hauling schedule he could not break. Cliff Tregenna said he had a sick mother in Springfield. The Hutchinson brothers said, more honestly than the other 2, that they had heard Norman Wentland in Darnell's, and they were not going to put their name on a project the county engineer had already called a mud pile. Lyle thanked each of them in the same calm voice and went home and did not ask anyone else. The first thing he did in the last 2 weeks of May 1973 was strip 11 inches of topsoil off the dam line and stack it in a long, low windrow 40 feet south of the cut. He moved roughly 380 cubic yards of topsoil with the round point shovel and a borrowed wheelbarrow, working from 6 in the morning until the heat built around 11, eating his dinner on a folded burlap sack at the lip of the ravine, working again from 3 in the afternoon until the light failed at 8:15. He lost 11 pounds in those 2 weeks. He drank 6 quarts of well water a day. Eunice, who was 66 and arthritic and had stopped going down to the back 44 years earlier, brought him a thermos of cold coffee at 4 o'clock every afternoon and stood at the lip with her hand shading her eyes and asked him each time the same question, which was whether anybody had come out yet to help, and he answered each time the same answer, which was no. In June, he started cutting the keyway. The keyway was the trench dug down to firm clay at the center line of where the dam wall would sit, into which the wall itself would be tied so that water would not slip beneath it. The 1937 pamphlet specified a keyway depth of 1/3 the finished dam height, which in Lyle's case meant a trench 14 feet deep and 4 feet wide, running 238 feet across the bottom of the ravine. He cut it with the round point shovel and the steel tamping bar and a sharpened mattock he had inherited from his grandfather. It took him 41 days. He hit limestone twice and worked around it. He hit a buried sycamore root the size of a man's thigh on the 18th of July and spent 2.5 days chopping it out with a single-bit axe. On August 9th, 1973, with the keyway cut and the long windrow of topsoil curing in the sun, Norman Wentland came back. He brought a young man with him from the Regional Soil and Water Conservation District office in Falworth, a thin, nervous man in a short-sleeved white shirt named Vernon Briggs, and Wentland walked Briggs to the south lip of the ravine and pointed at the keyway with the orange pen. "Tell him," Wentland said. "Tell him what's going to happen the first time he gets 6 inches of rain in a night." Vernon Briggs looked down at the keyway. Then he looked at the long windrow of topsoil. Then he looked at the soil sample coffee can, which Lyle had left sitting on a flat stone at the south lip. And he bent down and picked up a pinch of the clay between his thumb and forefinger and rolled it. "This is good clay, Norman," Briggs said quietly. "This is real good clay." Wentland made a sharp, dismissive sound through his nose, turned on his heel, and walked back to the green ford without waiting for Briggs. Briggs stood another minute at the lip. He looked down into the ravine where Lyle was working, raised one hand in a small, uncertain wave, and then followed his supervisor up to the truck. Lyle, in the bottom of the keyway, rested both hands on the haft of his mattock and watched them go. He kept working. He cut the spillway notch that fall. The spillway was the safety valve, the wide, shallow channel cut at one end of the dam, set 6 inches below the planned crest, that would carry overflow water around the wall in a heavy storm without ever letting the water rise high enough to overtop the dam itself. The 1937 pamphlet specified a spillway width calculated against drainage area, and for Lyle's 1,100-acre catchment, the table on page 31 called for a notch 42 feet wide and grass-lined, cut into undisturbed earth at the south end of the dam line, where the natural ground was 3 feet higher than the keyway. He cut the notch by hand with the same shovels, working through the cool, dry weeks of late September and all of October, and he sodded the bottom of it with bluegrass cut from his own yard in long, careful strips that Eunice carried down the south slope 4 at a time in a galvanized milk pail. Winter shut him down in the second week of November. The ground froze on the night of the 11th and stayed frozen in patches and then completely until the last week of March, 1974. He spent the winter on the dam in his head. He read the 1937 pamphlet 8 more times. He sat at the kitchen table with a stub of carpenter's pencil and worked out the volume calculation 3 different ways and got the same answer each time. At the planned crest height of 42 feet above the keyway floor, with the drowned area of the ravine and the back gully shaped the way it was, the pond would hold approximately 4 million gallons of water. He underlined the number twice. He did not tell anyone. He started building the wall itself on March 28, 1974. He hauled clay up from the bottom of the keyway in 6-inch lifts, packing each lift with the steel tamping bar and the back of the coal shovel until it rang dull when he struck it, the way the pamphlet said good packed clay should ring. He worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, through April and May and June and July and August. He did not take a day off except for Sundays and the 3rd of July, which was Eunice's birthday. He moved, by the careful estimate he wrote in the back of the 1937 pamphlet on the evening of September 4th, 1974. Slightly more than 9,400 cubic yards of clay and packed earth, by hand, with 1 shovel and 1 tamping bar and 1 borrowed wheelbarrow, whose front tire he patched 4 separate times. Norman Wentland drove the green ford past the south lip of the ravine on the gravel of Pickett Hollow Road 11 times during those 2 summers. He never stopped again after the August 1973 visit. He slowed down each time, looked, and drove on. The drivers from the co-op stopped twice that first June on the pretext of asking about a fence line easement that did not actually exist, and stood at the lip and watched Lyle for 10 minutes and walked back to their truck without saying a word. Otis Mossman, the cattle hauler, drove out alone on a Sunday afternoon in July of 1974, parked on the gravel, walked to the south lip, took off his straw hat, stood for almost an hour, put his hat back on, and drove away. He never told anyone he had been there. Lyle topped the dam on September 11th, 1974. He drove the last red-painted oak stub into the center line of the crest at 4 in the afternoon sighted across the 238 feet of finished wall with the pocket level on the surveyor's tripod, found it level to within 1.75 inches end to end, and sat down on the grass at the south end of the spillway notch and ate a cold ham sandwich Eunice had wrapped in waxed paper. The dam wall stood 41 feet 7 inches above the keyway floor. The spillway notch was 6 inches lower. The crest was 12 feet wide at the top, sloped at the angles the pamphlet table called for, and seeded already with a mix of brome grass and red clover that he had broadcast by hand the previous Wednesday. The pond began to fill on the night of October 4th, 1974, when the first hard fall rain dropped 2 3/10 inches on the upper catchment in 6 hours. By the morning of the 5th, there was 11 feet of water standing against the inside face of the dam. By the spring runoff in the third week of March 1975, the pond was at full pool. The water reached the lip of the spillway notch on the morning of March the 22nd. Lyle stood on the crest of the dam with the pocket level still in his shirt pocket and watched a thin, clear sheet of water slide out across the grass notch and run away down the natural ravine below, exactly as the 1937 pamphlet had said it would. He went home to dinner. He did not tell Eunice until after the cake. The summer that followed, 1975, was an ordinary one. The rains came when they were supposed to come. The corn went in on the 3rd of May and was knee-high by the 4th of July, the way the old saying called for. The pond sat full and quiet at the back of the property, and almost nobody outside the Halverson family seemed to remember it was there. Norman Wentland did not drive past on Pickett Hollow Road for any of those 12 weeks. The Tilden County Agricultural Extension agent, a young man named Stanley Gantry, came out once on a Tuesday in late June, walked the crest with Lyle for 40 minutes, asked 9 questions, wrote the answers down in a small black notebook, and said at the end that he had never in 4 years on the job seen a private farm pond cut to USDA spec by a single pair of hands. Lyle thanked him. Stanley Gantry filed his notes. Nothing came of them. Nothing needed to. The first drought summer came in 1976. It started early that year. The last good rain in Tilden County fell on the 18th of May. June produced 0.6 of an inch across 3 brief storms. July produced nothing. By the second week of August, the corn in the bottom fields up and down State Route 19 was rolling its leaves at 10 in the morning. The soybean in the uplands was 12 inches shorter than it should have been, and 17 of the shallow farm wells in the southern half of the county had dropped below their pump intakes. Otis Mossman lost the use of his stock pond on August 4th. The Mossman cattle were down to muddy puddles by August 9th. On August 11th, Otis drove out to Pickett Hollow Road in a battered stock trailer and sat in the cab of his pickup at the gate for almost 20 minutes before he got out and walked up the long lane to the house. Lyle was on the back porch, sharpening a hoe blade. He set the hoe down, listened, and said one sentence. "Bring them over, Otis. There's water enough." The Mossman herd, 58 head of black Angus crosses, walked across the south pasture of the Halverson place at sundown on August 11th, 1976. And drank from the shallow east end of the pond Lyle had built. They stayed 7 weeks. The pond level dropped roughly 14 inches across those 7 weeks and was back to full pool by the second week of November on the fall rains. Lyle did not charge Otis Mossman $1. Otis tried to leave a check for $400 on the kitchen table the morning he hauled his cattle home, and Lyle walked it out to the stock trailer and tucked it into Otis's shirt pocket without a word. The drought of 1976 was the first the pond held. The drought of 1977 came in late July and ran through September and dropped the well water table across Tilden County by an additional 4 feet. The pond held. The Halverson South fields stayed green into October. Lyle siphoned irrigation water through 800 feet of 2-inch black plastic pipe he ran from the spillway to the head of the bottom corn. Gravity-fed, no pump. He cut 184 bushels an acre off that corn in the fall of 1977, while his neighbor across the section line cut 71. The drought of 1978 was a short, hard one in early August. The pond held. The drought of 1979 lasted 11 weeks. The pond dropped 22 inches and held. The droughts of 1980 and 1981 came back to back, the worst 2-year stretch the county had seen since the Dust Bowl tail end of 1936 and 1937. The Big Pine River ran below its summer minimum for 91 consecutive days in 1980. 43 farm wells in Tilden County went dry. 2 dairy operations south of Belknap sold out. The county courthouse in Falworth held an emergency hearing on rural water in September of 1981, at which the testifying engineer was a tired and quieter man named Norman Wentland, who had by then been the county engineer for 12 years, and looked, by the count of those who were in the room, 10 years older than he had on the May afternoon he had stood at the lip of Sutter's Branch with an orange pen behind his ear. He did not mention Lyle Halverson by name in his testimony. He did not have to. 3 different farmers in the audience mentioned him for Wentland in the polite, formal way rural Missourians have of speaking truth in a public room. "There's a man south of Belknap," one of them said. "Got 240 acres on Picket Hollow Road. Built himself a pond by hand in 73 and 74. His cattle are drinking. His corn is green. Maybe the county engineer's office could go out and look at how he'd done it." Wentland did not look up from the table. The pond held through 1980. The pond held through 1981. The droughts of 1982 and 1983 were the 8th and the 9th. The 8th was a long, slow dry that took the county's spring rains and gave nothing back through July. The 9th was a short, brutal 3-week heat in August of 1983 that broke the county temperature record on 3 separate days. The pond dropped 28 inches across the 9 summers altogether, and was back to full pool every fall on the rains, and never once approached the keyway, and never once threatened the spillway, and never once gave out. Norman Wentland retired from the Tilden County Engineer's office in November of 1983. There was a small gathering in a back room at the courthouse in Falworth. There was a sheet cake. There were 11 people present. He gave a short speech that mentioned, among other things, the importance of trusting professional judgment over folk practice. 3 of the 11 people in the room were the same men who had laughed at Lyle Halverson in Darnell's Feed and Supply 10 years and 7 months earlier, and not one of them met Wentland's eye while he said it. Lyle Halverson did not attend. He was, that afternoon, on the crest of his own dam in the cold November sun, walking the 238 feet end to end with the pocket level still in his shirt pocket, checking the brome grass and the red clover for winter cover. The pond behind him was at full pool. The water was the deep, clear green of late fall farm water in good clay country. He turned at the south end above the spillway notch, walked the crest back to the north end, and stood for a long moment looking out across his 240 acres in the long blue light. He died in March of 1991 in the same house his father had built in 1909 at the age of 86. The dam was 18 years old. It had outlived its builder by no time at all, exactly as the pamphlet had warned a man it might not. But it had also done the other thing the pamphlet had said it would do, which was to outlive him afterward by 100 years if anybody was willing to keep walking the crest. His son walked it for 23 years. His grandson walks it now. In May of 2024, on a warm, bright afternoon, with the dogwoods turning along the same fence rows where Lyle had walked out to the back 51 years before, Cliff Halverson, 32 years old, 6 feet tall, the same family John Deere ball cap on his head, with the brim sun-bleached almost gray, climbed down out of a 2019 Chevrolet pickup on the gravel of Pickett Hollow Road and walked the long lane back to the dam. He carried his grandfather's greasy red rubber-banded pocket notebook in the chest pocket of a red and black plaid flannel shirt. He carried the same pocket level. He climbed the south end of the crest, walked the 238 feet end to end, stopped at the north end above the spillway notch, and looked down. The pond was at full pool. The water was the same deep, clear green. The brome grass and the red clover on the crest were thick and well cured. The spillway notch was grassed and clean and exactly 6 inches below the crest, the way it had been cut by hand in October of 1973. 2 great blue herons stood in the shallow east end where the Moss Man cattle had drunk in the dry August of 1976. A red-tailed hawk turned a slow circle over the south pasture. Cliff Halverson took the notebook out of his chest pocket, opened it to the inside back cover, and added a single line under his grandfather's last entry, which had been made on the 1st of March in 1991. The line said, May 2024, crest level to within 1 inch end to end, spillway clear, pond at full pool, 51st year. He closed the notebook. He stood another long minute on the crest. He walked back to his pickup. He drove home. The 1937 USDA pamphlet sits today in a glass-fronted cabinet in the front room of the same house Lyle's father built in 1909. The orange pen mark Norman Wentland made on the butcher paper drawing in Darnell's Feed and Supply on an April afternoon in 1973 has long since faded out of the paper. The dam is 51 years old. It has held through 9 droughts, 2 100-year storms, 1 ice event, and the deaths of 4 of the men who stood in Darnell's that morning and laughed. Some knowledge doesn't get louder. When the world doubts it, it just waits.